Hello. Could somebody please confirm that you hear me? All right, excellent. Okay. So let us wait for 1 more minute and then I start. I've received a few questions in advance and I will address them, but I will try to do this towards the end. So first of all, I will try to give you a broader picture of what economics is, and then I zoom in into 2 questions of natural resource economics, which seem to worry people. This is exhaustibility of resources. So we can run out of coal or oil at some point. And the fact that by extracting resources and using oil or coal, we can negatively, and maybe even sometimes positively, but often negatively, affect the environment. And then towards the end, I will try to address some of the questions you may have. Now, it's 4:05 in Moscow. We have quite a few of you already participating. This is great. So I can see in the chat the things you're writing. For the next 50-55 minutes, I will try to speak English slowly, clearly. And if you have questions at any point, please do interrupt, either in the chat or via the microphone. You can also ask your questions in Russian. So I was born in the Soviet Union, in a region which is nowadays known as Kazakhstan, in particular in the city of Karaganda. So I do understand Russian, but the lecture will still be in Russian, in English, because it is one thing to discuss simple everyday life in a language. It's another thing to teach in a language, and English is the language in which I prefer to teach. So, yeah. Let's get going. So my specialty, so I'm assistant professor at the New Economic School in Moscow. In Russian, this is Российская экономическая школа. And we're cooperating on a joint program with the Higher School of Economics, Высшая школа экономики, on a bachelor program. And the ideas which I will present to you now, I also teach on this joint bachelor program, which is within the area of natural resource economics. Alrighty, let's get going. So, first of all, since I arrived in Moscow 2 years ago, I understood a very important thing, which in the context of today's lecture is actually important. Many people do not know what economists do. In fact, many people don't know what economists are. I think this has historical reasons. But let me give you one definition, which is coming from maybe one of the most famous economists of the 20th century. This is John Maynard Keynes. The master economist must possess a rare combination of gifts. He must be a mathematician, a historian, a statesman, a philosopher, in some degree. He must understand symbols because of math and speak in words because he needs to communicate, or she needs to communicate to the public. He must contemplate the particular in terms of the general and touch abstract and concrete in the same flight of thought. He must study the present in light of the past for the purpose of the future. No part of man's nature or his institutions must lie entirely outside his regard. And I think the idea which Keynes describes is easiest understood if you think about a general practitioner in medicine. Домашний врач. You want your doctor who takes care of your body to be aware of all the literature on medicine, but you also want him to be able to communicate it to you in a simple way. And you want the doctor being aware of the specificities which apply to you personally. Did you have a particular sickness in the past? What is your family relation? What is your psychological state? So similar to a doctor taking care of a human's body, an economist takes care of the overall economy. And hence needs to be aware of many different subjects at the same time. Now, let's zoom in a bit. Economics can deal with many questions. Many of you might have heard of what the activities the central bank is doing by regulating the interest rate, by policymakers setting tariffs and evading trade flows. But we also can think of natural resources from the perspective of economics. In particular, if people think about natural resources, they typically worry about two things. One is we might run out of resources, and the other one is the use of resources may somehow affect the climate. We will talk about both. And when we talk about both, I will use in particular these 6 sources. So if you want to go and read more or check that what I'm saying makes sense, you can check these papers. So the first 2, Diamond is Jared Diamond. It's a book. Jared Diamond, I'm a big fan of Jared Diamond. He writes popular books on the development of humans. And there he asks the question, what leads to survival of civilization? Is it possible that civilizations collapse because they run out of resources? And he tries to answer this, and I will use examples from his book. Jürgen is another book which focuses on natural resources. I will use this only a bit. And then you have 4 famous papers, and all those gentlemen I will introduce to you as we go along with pictures. At this point, let me ask, do you understand me? Am I speaking too fast, too slow? All right, cool. Thank you for the feedback. This is good. So let's go through the examples. So typically we differentiate. One of the comments, it's too clear. There is no such thing as too clear. As I mentioned in the beginning, the job of an economist is to understand the difficult complications of an issue, but be able to communicate in the simplest possible way to communicate the basic idea. And I will try to do this. All right, so typically we differentiate in two types of resources. One is renewable and one is non-renewable. The non-renewable is defined as it doesn't renew itself at a sufficiently high rate for sustainable use. Typically we think of minerals of fossil fuels such as oil because it takes millions of years to produce it. The renewable, it does renew itself at a sufficiently high rate for sustainable use. In principle, this is timber and fisheries, forestry, fish. We will go through these two separately and start by running out of resources. So the first gentleman to think about this was Thomas Robert Malthus. Roughly 250 years ago he was born, and his basic idea, which entered economic until today, is that. So on the x-axis you see time, and on the y-axis you see quantity. And his idea is, look, the progress in wheat production is so slow, so this line is nearly horizontal. Over time, the quantity people were able to produce wheat didn't change much. On the other hand, population was growing like crazy. But the thing is, if the population is growing very fast while resources are rather constant, at some point we will reach the limit with which people can survive, since resources per person will start falling because this is growing fast and this is rather stable. And then and this has been since him called a Malthusian catastrophe, and people would argue if the distance between those two becomes too high, this means people start killing themselves or starve to death. Now, the obvious question you can ask at this point, did this actually ever happen? So, maybe somebody of you has heard of the Easter Island. This is an island in the Pacific Ocean to the west of Chile. If you haven't heard of it, most certainly you have seen those guys. The island is famous for these guys because the culture which developed on Easter Island started producing those guys at some point. And in order to move these guys, they needed trees. They've cut down trees and used those trees to transport the stone all over the island. At some point, they became so obsessed with this that actually deforestation became a big problem for this island, 12th to 15th century. So they kept using up the trees faster than the trees could grow. And what they ended up doing, they committed ecocide. So at some point, they've cut the last tree, and since then, the island doesn't have any trees anymore, if you visit it today. Now you can ask, well, these guys have been a bit stupid. Certainly, this is not inevitable. So you might find a cure for this. Well, let's see. Let's take another example. So roughly 600 years ago as well, Japan had a very similar problem. Oh, sorry, 500 years ago. They also faced a deforestation problem, roughly the same time, a bit later than the Easter Island. They also were using up the trees too fast and didn't reproduce them sufficiently fast. But they came up with a solution. In particular, they come up with the solution of forest management. What happened in particular? Well, in what is nowadays Tokyo, there was a great fire in 1657. And because all the houses were made out of wood, timber, they suddenly had this quick demand shock to bring more timber to the city in order to rebuild it. And at that point, they realized that actually there was a shortage in timber. So the Japanese have been not sufficiently careful in the preceding 100 years, and they realized, oh my God, we're running out of forests. So what they did is they introduced regulations. In particular, they introduced government regulations, which limited the amount of a common good that is available to use by an individual. Essentially, what they did, they specified who could do what, where, when, how, and how much. Later, the government also introduced incentives to increase supply by planting trees. I'm not sure whether this is actually also something the Russians say, but I know that some of the cultures in which I lived in, so I lived in the Soviet Union, in Germany, and in the UK, that it's common to say that one of the things a man or a woman needs to do over its life is to plant at least one tree. And I think the idea that we introduce this concept into our norms is basically has been basically created roughly 300 years ago when we understood that we have limited supply of forests. So in order to have enough forests in the long run, we actually need to plant one per person during the lifetime at least. Is Japan the only one which had the problem and found a solution? No. So in a region which is nowadays Germany, but at that time was independent, Saxony, so Germany is here. For those of you who have difficulties with geography, Russia would be ungefähr here, approximately here. So wait, where's Kaliningrad? So this would be Kaliningrad, which is nowadays Russia. So Saxony had actually a similar problem. Roughly the same time, the mining industry was developing in Saxony, and because of the industrialization and the need to smelt ores, they needed timber. And again, similar to Japan and the Easter Islands, they were using the timber faster than it could have been reproduced. As a result of that, the Germans came up with quite a few concepts, but maybe the most important one was introduced by this gentleman, which I'm also citing before. He introduced the idea of sustainability. In particular, the idea of sustainability, maybe nowadays known by everybody, at that point in time wasn't a general concept. And in fact, if you check the Wikipedia page of sustainability, you will see that, for some reason I cannot see, yes, Hans Karl von Karlowitz is actually attributed the origin of the concept of sustainability, which comes from forestry. So this guy was living in Saxony and he understood, look, we're using up forests and timber far too quickly to this to be sustainable. In German, it's called Nachhaltigkeit. And since then, it's a thing. In economics, sustainability is defined in non-declining total consumption per capita over time. This is a very general, abstract way of thinking about it. And since economists started thinking about it, they came up with many ideas and solutions how to make sure that consumption per capita over time will not be decreasing, will either be stable or increasing over time. And the typical things are, for instance, regulations. So you do not allow people to use too much of a limited supply, or in the long run, you actually increase supply by introducing the ideas into people's head that over the lifetime they need to plant a tree at least once in their life because it's a good thing. So, how is this all, we are Russia, how is this all linked to Russia? Or let me check. Are there any questions at this point? So what I did up to now to you, I introduced to you the basic idea of economics, what an economist is, what an economist does. So I think you can think of an economist being the doctor of an economy and making sure that the economy runs smoothly. And for that, the economist needs to be familiar with many different concepts, be able to understand complicated things and communicate them in the simplest possible way to make sure that the public understands, which is a big issue right now, as you might know, because people believe or started believing in alternative facts. So you want to be as explicit and precise as possible, not to avoid any confusion. And then I zoomed in on that resource economics and asked whether, in case of renewable resources, we need to be worried that we can run out of renewables. And then I gave you an example that, well, in the past there was an issue, and we did face something like that. There was a question, I will try to answer this in a sec. And then I've shown you two examples, Germany and Japan, which face similar issues as Easter Island, but instead of failing to manage it, they did manage, and they introduced concepts of regulation and increase in supply over the long run. To such an extent that the forests of Germany and Japan nowadays are considered among the best managed, because afterwards they developed many other concepts. And now I wanted to move to Russia, but first a question. Who came up with the idea of forest management in Japan? Okay, let me answer this in two ways. If you want to check it for sure, because I will now guess a bit, you need to check, 1 second. You need to check this book. This is the book I'm citing. And there, Jared Diamond talks about this specific situation. And so this is Collapse by Jared Diamond, 2005. And he explains who came up with it, when, and what happened, and why this was an issue in the first place. Now, who came up with it? The thing is that most societies in that period have been non-democratic and hence authoritarian. So you had one leader who would make the decision, such that it was absolutely essential that the leader is convinced by the necessity of starting the regulation. So while I'm sure the leader must have had some advisors, in the end of the day, the very fact that the leader of Japan at that time was willing to listen and to implement those policies is actually crucial. So to a certain extent, you can attribute the fact that Japan was using those things, the regulations, to the leader of Japan at that time. And I don't know exactly who that is, but it must be end of the 17th century. All right, how is this linked to Russia? Well, as you might or might not know, Russia's forests represent a huge share of total global forest, next to Brazil, essentially just. Unfortunately, right now, there are issues. Issues we have everywhere. The issues here are that Russia was exposed to wildfires in the last 10 years, partly to a certain extent, I guess, because of suboptimal management. And there is illegal logging. Again, this is not just Russia, many other countries, but the thing is that Russia's forest is particularly important for the global economy. Why? Because a large forest is crucial for climate change, and we will talk about this later. In general, from the examples and from the current situation in Russia, we see that the concept and the idea of sustainability, wherever it comes up in history, emerges in time of crisis, of scarcity. So as soon as we hit the constraint and we understand, oh my God, it's not enough actually by any reasonable standard, then, only then, we start being worried. And right now, I guess people in Russia are not worried yet, or globally, simply because of the huge size of the forest. Now, so I talked now to you about non-renewables, renewables. Now let's move to non-renewables. Was there ever a situation where a country would run out of non-renewables? Well, here the example I'm going to use is coming from a tiny island in the Pacific Ocean, and it's the island of Nauru. What happened to Nauru? Well, in 1975, Nauru had the highest per capita in the world, GDP per capita in the world. So in terms of how much they were producing per person, they were on top of the world. Why? They happened to have very large phosphate deposits because of feces of birds, which they left behind when visiting the island. When understanding the population of Nauru started extracting the phosphate very quickly and selling it and not wisely investing the money. As a consequence, unfortunately, nowadays, GDP per capita in this country is roughly $10,000, and it depends on Australian aid. So it became a very poor country from being the richest country. Why? Because they mismanaged the resource they had. Let me ask again, is this inevitable? Are we bound to run out of resources? Well, no, not necessarily. So a very nice example comes from Botswana. By the way, for those of you who don't want to read too much about this, I think there is a really nice recent movie, like came out 2018, about the transition of Botswana becoming independent. I think something like The King of Botswana or something like that. And Nelson Mandela himself, I think, was quoted to have said that the King of Botswana is a really good guy. So basically, Botswana got lucky roughly 50 years ago because they get a dictator, a king, but what economists call a benevolent king. A king, a dictator who deeply cares about his people. And what he did is, in 1966, Botswana was one of the poorest, so the opposite of Nauru, one of the poorest countries in the world. With many, many different tricks, the king did something extremely smart, which I don't have time to zoom into. Maybe we'll end up discussing this. Let me write this down, because I think it's a very cool thing. The king of Botswana did something very smart, such that the discoveries of large diamond reserves were in principle be able to benefit the people of Botswana. And then, after selling the diamonds to the rest of the world, he invested the money very wisely. And nowadays, Botswana has a GDP per capita reaching 20,000, which is close to Belarus, which is your neighbor. So it's not inevitable. Again, you need a good leader who does the right thing. What is the right thing? Well, essentially, the monarch of Botswana, Seretse Khama, that's the name of the guy, I forgot it before. He used consultants, good people he trusted, who understood what they're talking about. And one of the things they did, they used what economists call the Hartwick Rule. And this is essentially, if you take capital out of the ground in the form of resources like diamonds, oil, coal, do not consume the money. For some people it's obvious, for some people it's not. Do not consume the money. What you instead need to do, you need partly save it for bad times and partly invest it in public infrastructure like education, health. Obviously, at this point, what I will do is, how is this related to Russia? So there is a question which I do not want to go into right now, but the numbers I gave you is in purchasing power parity, which takes into account local prices and pushes up a bit the GDP per capita. And I guess the question the person is asking is in, okay, good. So, how is this concept related to Russia? As most of you, I guess, know, Russia is an oil-rich economy. And this features very strongly in Russia's GDP and in the income the state has to govern the country. So the source of public expenditure. In particular, in both cases, it's roughly 30% in terms of GDP and in income for public expenditure. So what did Russia do? In fact, Russia in this perspective did well. In 2004, the government of Russia introduced a stabilization fund of the Russian Federation, where rents from resources are invested in a diversified portfolio of foreign assets. So they did indeed share a certain part of the resources. Now, there was some movement back and forth, but overall, in the current version, $67 billion are saved in assets. With a population of roughly 144 million, this gives every Russian around $500, which in principle should be used in difficult situations such as now. Why the Russian government decides not to use this money right now, I do not completely understand. But initially, the idea was to save this money for situations like this one. Did they invest? Yes. So this graph is taken from a thesis of one of my students who was thinking about those things. And what you see here on the x-axis is years, and on the y-axis, the total amount of investment. The orange line is the oil price, and the blue columns are spending on road infrastructure. So you see that there was a strong relationship between oil price and investment in infrastructure, suggesting that part of the oil revenues coming into the budget of the government could have been spent on infrastructure projects. So yeah, Russia, dependent on oil, did indeed save some of the money for bad times, and indeed invested part of it in infrastructure. So, what did I tell you now? I started with describing who is an economist. Then I talked to you about running out of non-renewable resources, renewable resources, timber, and gave you examples of both failing to manage and not failing to manage. And then I looked at non-renewable resources and gave you examples again of both failing and not failing to manage. So the promising thing is that in both cases of renewables and non-renewables, in the past we have seen that governments came up with solutions which were able to help the economy to do well, such that we can hope that in the future this will happen again. Now, in the third part of this lecture, I want to talk about pollution and climate change. Why do I want to talk about this? Well, first of all, Diamond talks about this in his book and gives nice examples. Second, right now it's considered to be one of the biggest problems globally, climate change in particular. And third, my impression after teaching this 2 years in a row is that Russian students are surprisingly skeptical towards it. So I will not even try, because we don't even have time, to go into the details of man-caused climate change. So at no point in time will I try to convince you that what you're observing now is caused by humans. I think there is a lot of evidence out there suggesting that this is true, but we don't need to talk about this. What we will talk about is simply how humans can adjust to changing climate conditions. So this is a different question. So we're not talking about what changes the climate, we're talking about facing the fact that the climate is changing. What has been done in the past and what can we do in the future? So first, some basic. What is a carbon cycle? Well, plants take in carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. That allows them to create energy. Animals consume plants to get this energy. And plants and animals release carbon dioxide when they decompose and burn. So plants get this energy from the sun, we eat plants, we die, we decompose, we release carbon dioxide. And this is when this carbon dioxide again can be absorbed by the plants. What does it mean? Again, I will not discuss that, but what does it mean for a human being to affect this? Well, oil, which we're getting out of the ground, are essentially organisms which have been decomposed and have been stored under the earth for a long period of time, millions of years. Now we're getting this stuff out and releasing it into the atmosphere. So from a theoretical point of view, this should change the balance, at least a bit, since stuff which has been stored in the earth crust is now released. Independent of the reason of climate change, I think it is really not debatable that temperature increased in the last 100 years by roughly 1 degree Celsius. This is really not debatable. That's a fact. In fact, let's link this to Russia, because in the last 2 years, since I'm here, I've seen this. And so I looked at the data and produced some graphs which allow to make the same point by simply focusing on Moscow. So this is something I just produced by asking one of my students to get me data on temperature for Moscow. And she sent me data for the period of the last 80, 90 years, something like that. No, 80, 50, 70. And what you see here on the x-axis, you see years. On the y-axis, you see the minimum temperature in December in Celsius. You can do the same graph with average or maximum temperature, it doesn't matter. Note the y-axis, it's 0. So all we observe is below 0 in December. And what you see here is an upward sloping relationship. So the further we go towards the present from the past, the higher the minimum temperature in December. Now, what we can do, and this is something, again, we're teaching here, and you would be taught in econometrics, is the identification of a structural break. What is a structural break? A structural break is an unexpected change in a relationship between two variables. So here we have a upward sloping relationship, closer to the present, higher minimum temperature. But maybe there was a break in this time period of these 70 years. And there are statistical techniques which allow us to identify such breaks. In this specific case, such a break would be in 1960. In particular, until 1960, there was barely any relationship, if at all downward sloping, between temperature and years. And since the 1960s, there is a clear upwards trend. And this upwards trend tells us that since 1960, the temperature has been increasing by 3/4 degrees Celsius every decade, which adds up to roughly 4.5 degrees Celsius since 1960. If we will keep going like this, within the next 30 years, the average temperature in December in Moscow will be 0. So you will not have much snow. And this is where my story started. The first year I arrived here, there was the winter 2018 to 2019. The winter in Moscow was beautiful. End of October, we had snow, and this snow stayed there until roughly end of March. Now we barely have any snow, and it's the 1st of December. Now, one sec, there is a question. So the question is it connected to nuclear weapons test? So I guess what the person is asking me is whether nuclear weapon tests have caused an increase in global temperature. I would be surprised if this is the case. So I'm not aware of any evidence on this, but I cannot completely exclude it simply because I'm not aware of it. So I'm not aware of it, and I would be surprised if the detonation of a bomb can trigger this. But maybe. Yes, absolutely. I think some of the people already point out, hey, wait a second. There might be many other reasons why the temperature of Moscow increased in the last 1960 years. One of them may be the city expanded and actually simply included the location of the machine which is measuring this temperature, such that the area around this machine became warmer. And I think this is in line with the argument made by one of you. Maybe we simply have a much higher population, which makes the area much warmer. Absolutely. I will at no point claim that this change in temperature is exclusively due to change in temperature. This specific statistical exercise doesn't allow me to do this. I need to think much harder. But note that the year 1960 is very much in line with the year determined by many cities around the world and many rural regions around the world, which started documenting an upward trend in temperature. I gave you Moscow as an example simply because of the story I told you. I noticed it here. And I guess you all can link to Moscow more than you care about, I don't know, Berlin, New York, or London. But you're absolutely right. There may be other reasons. So this number I gave you, this one, 1 degree in 100 years. This is true for the world as a whole. And in fact, actually, if you want to push your argument a bit further, this number tells you roughly 1 degree Celsius. Calculation for Moscow tells you roughly 4.5. So I guess the difference between the two you can attribute to the increase of the city, increase in population, increased number of cars. This is how I'm thinking about it. Is that clear? Okay. I will assume I made my point. Okay. All right. So let me go back to Diamond and ask, did this ever happen in the past? So okay, we're now facing a global change in temperature, and we frequently have faced local changes in temperature. But have there been situations in the past where civilizations literally collapsed from a change in the climate? Yes. And the example which is told by Diamond are the Norse. Who are the Norse? Think of them as Vikings who migrated and populated, in particular, the western part of Greenland. So the US is here, and that's Iceland. Scandinavia is here. Russia is roughly here. So what happened? I want to use the last 7 minutes to explain to you one simple concept in economics, which I think is important. And for that, I will zoom forward from the Vikings and the Moche to the UK and the industrialization and talk a bit about Jevons. William Jevons, roughly 150 years ago, posed what is known as the coal question. And the two things he asked, by seeing how companies would very quickly use up the coal the UK had starting the industrialization and use a lot of the timber to extract the coal, are we wise? Okay, so I'm not sure I understand the last sentence, but one of the question, I guess it's a question, says, did you know that if we cut down all the Amazon forest and planted rice there, we would get more oxygen than from trees, and we would get rice? No, I did not know that. I would need to check whether this is true. I'm a bit surprised. Fine, but then it's, I guess, not a question, it's a statement. And it's up to me to check the correctness of this statement. Yes, I've been wondering why in so many cultures you have this idea that as people grow up, they're told by the parents that one of the responsibilities you have as a human being, and I think it was a big concept in the Soviet Union as well, you should plant a tree. And I think this is partly motivated by the fact that in the past, all those countries faced some constraints in the availability of timber. Okay, I have a couple of other questions. Let me check them. In the meantime, you can ask. We'll wait a bit longer. Okay. Another question. Are there any ways of quantitative evaluation of such climate changes, or for examples of deforestation? So in terms of evaluation of climate change is actually very, very simple. I mean, it depends on what you are. So climate change is multidimensional. It has many, many dimensions. One of the dimensions of the climate is the temperature. And what we have seen in the last 100 years is that the average temperature globally has been increasing. This is why I gave you the Moscow example. The same is true for many other countries. And these things are particularly bad for poor countries for many reasons. So if you're asking, can we evaluate changes in terms of temperature? That's straightforward and easy. but we can also, and this is what economists are doing, trying to evaluate the impact of climate change on the local economy or the national economy, and this we can do as well. So we can say that if temperature increases by 1 degree Celsius, our валовый внутренний продукт will drop by 0.5% or something like that. So we can actually evaluate the cost of climate change. Now, deforestation is a bit more complicated. Why? Because first of all, it's more difficult to measure. What economists started using now are visualization from space. So you have machines flying around the Earth making pictures of the Earth below, and the quality of those pictures by now is so good that we can actually track if deforestation takes place and then calculate this. What surprised me, and I think this is an interesting area of research, there didn't seem to much literature on the impact or even the size of Russian deforestation. Where exactly it takes place, what are the issues, stuff like this. So I think this is maybe an interesting area to do research in, to understand this better. Only oil production damages the atmosphere. No, there are many reasons why there are many reasons why climate may change. What I told you from before is that fossil fuels, so this is oil, gas, and coal, this is, in the end of the day, trees, animals, and people who died many years ago, fell into basins, what is geologically known as basins, then stuff like stones falls on top of this, so they are conservated in there. And if they stay there for a long period of time under pressure, they turn into coal, oil, or gas. So as you release this, this will somehow increase the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere and hence change the balance. This is what many believe causes predominantly, or not predominantly, to a large extent, the change in the climate. But here we're already discussing what causes the change in the climate rather than thinking how to adjust to a change in the climate. How can humanity affect climate change in a positive way? Okay, I think I would ask a clarification question. Let me just guess. I think when you say positive, you mean negative. Like, how can we reduce the impact of climate change, or how we can reduce climate change? I suspect that's what you mean. Well, there are many ways, and actually, this is the stuff many leaders of developing and developed countries are discussing. So one is to agree to limit the consumption of fossil fuels. And the easiest way to do this, and again, economists developed a couple of mechanisms which make it easy to make sure that it comes at the lowest possible cost, is to switch from coal to oil or gas. So coal is the dirtiest. So per unit of energy, it releases the highest number of CO2 units into the atmosphere. So we would do already incredibly well by simply switching from coal to oil or gas. That would be already a very good thing. Unfortunately, if you look at the data, it suggests that still many countries use lots of coal, including Russia, and that in some cases, coal plants are still built. So I guess the first step we can do is try to move away from coal to other type of fossil fuels. Is the size of invests to the developing the alternative resources growing? is the size of invest to the developing? I'm sorry, I do not understand the question, but you can also write in Russian and I think I can read it, and I will still answer in English if that's okay, but I don't understand the question, I'm sorry. I meant exactly an evaluation. Okay, that means I need to go up. There was. Oh, yes. So, okay, so there is a follow-up question to the discussion. Can we quantify the cost of climate change and deforestation? So, for climate change, there are actually quite a few papers already out there. So this has been tried and evaluated already many, many times in the last 15 years. And as I said, the cost in terms of GDP is particularly large for less developed poor countries, partly because they will not be able to adjust as quickly as developed industrialized countries. If you are in particular interested in this, you can just drop me an email. I will send you a paper. When do you think ice in Antarctic continent will be melted in rate which dangerous for humanity? Okay, so I think we're already there. So this point, I think, is in the past. So most climate scientists agree that we are already at a far too fast rate. But I'm maybe not the most competent person to speak about the climatic changes. I'm an economist, so I'm thinking about the link between the economy and what happens. So how do we as people, being aware of the fact that we're impacting the climate, or we're aware of the fact that we're running out of resources, how should we change how we function to still function well? Растут ли размеры инвестиций в разработку альтернативных ресурсов? Yes, okay, now I got it. Thank you. Yes, so that's absolutely yes. So this is a big yes. There are huge amounts of money flowing into the development of renewable energy. The classical types of renewable energy would be wind and solar, and both developed OECD countries as well as catching up huge giants like China are investing in the development of solar and wind. From the top of my head, I think for a significant period of time, the leaders in this technology in particular have been Denmark and Germany. Hope I'm telling you the truth here, but certainly at some point Denmark and Germany would have had a significant amount of money being put into renewable energy. More importantly, and maybe this is also related to your questions, many states being aware of the importance of transitioning from fossil fuels to renewables started subsidizing. So this is another tool which economists frequently use. If you believe that the particular industry should develop, what you can do as a state is you can subsidize it by decreasing the costs of developing the industry. Yeah. So I think that's one of the questions which was in the email. Sorry, I had difficulties finding it now. So the question is whether climate change is good for Russia. So let me make and try to give you the general picture. So if you just focus on Russia, there is evidence which suggests that for Russia, potentially, this could actually end up being not such a bad thing. Why is that? Well, places like Magadan, Norilsk, Vorkuta, they're obviously located in regions where you have permafrost, meaning that the soil is basically non-productive. You can't grow anything. So you can make the argument, well, if on average it becomes warmer, permafrost will melt, and as a consequence of this, actually the Russians would get more land and they can start producing more agricultural goods, so it could be a good thing. Maybe. This is not a crazy argument to make. I haven't seen the papers on this, and I think one of the reasons is it's not like this country in particular has an issue with scarcity of land. You have lots of it. This is not what is constraining your productions. What's constraining your production are things which are unrelated to land. Now, let me give you another argument. So one of my students wrote an excellent thesis, Alina Gafanova, last year. And so she was part of the bachelor's program. And she went now to the University of Chicago to work there. And she was looking at how climate change, local changes in climate and average temperature across Russia in particular, affected the spread of certain diseases. And I will not go into the technological literature and give you the exact names, partly because I do not remember them, but I give you the basic idea. If stuff is melting, bacteria and viruses, which haven't been around for many, many years, suddenly are released from ice and can spread. And she essentially shows that there are some diseases which are very sensitive to changes in local climate, indeed start spreading quicker if the climate increases. So this is the takeaway of her thesis. So yeah, there may be upsides, but there would be also downsides. Maybe more importantly, and I'm still not making the moral argument of caring about other people. Note, right? So obviously there is also in the background a moral argument, just to be aware of the fact that for many countries this will not be a good thing at all. But what you will necessarily also see, you will see potentially more migration. In history, I've seen in the last 10,000 years that one of the big triggers of migration is local climate change, for obvious reasons. So if Russia is doing well, while all the other countries are doing worse, what this will necessarily mean that Russia will be exposed to migration. Now, whether this is a good or a bad thing, this is another very important big economic question. But I've lived in this country for 2 years, and my impression is that the average Russian is not too fond of too much migration. Yes, exactly. We should close the borders. So whether this will work or whether this will not work is another very nice discussion, and I'm sure, yeah. This is something you would be forced to think about very, very carefully during your education as an economist. Because in the end of the day, let me give you the example of we should close the border, going back to the medicine. So I will get the details wrong, but the idea will be right. So I told you that I like to think of an economist as a doctor of an economy overall, and making sure that it functions well. Now, if I'm not mistaken, roughly 100 years ago, people understood, or 150 years ago, because of huge increase in population densities in cities, cholera started spreading very quickly in highly populated areas. This is something I will check, actually. I'm pretty sure what I'm telling you is true, but please treat it carefully. And initially, people didn't quite know how to treat cholera, but one of the symptoms, apparently, is that you have lots of diarrhea, extreme form. So what they decided, it would be a smart thing. Let's just not give people too much water so they won't have too much diarrhea. But the thing is, when the human body is fighting with the bacteria, it needs a lot of water. So coming up with a conclusion that not giving water will reduce diarrhea eventually resulted in the death of many people. Similarly, I think closing the borders is a very fast reached conclusion, which not necessarily will do well the Russian economy. So be careful with that. All right. So I think we have something like a few minutes left. Are there any further questions? Oh, this is very important question, I think. So the Russian economy very strongly depends on oil. There is absolutely no doubt about this, and one of the symptoms of this is you can look at what happened to your exchange rates relative to dollar or euro, depending on where the price of 1 barrel of oil moves. So typically, your economy is deeply dependent on the price of oil. And your economy is devaluated down heavily. The exchange rate drops relative to the dollar if the price of oil drops. And this is a sign how dependent you are. If you compare this is similar to Norway, which is a small open economy, also heavily dependent on oil. Now, what can be done about this? So the short answer is it's heavily dependent. The next question is, so similar to what we discussed, did countries run out of timber? Did countries experience a change in climate? So the answer is yes, yes, yes. The question is, what can we do about it? This is basically my research agenda. This is stuff I'm working on in my research next to my lectures. And one of the typical ways which you can reduce dependence of an economy is by indeed subsidizing alternative sectors of the economy which are not dependent on the collapse of the oil price. And as you suggest here, green technology might be one such thing. So in principle, the government could subsidize and stimulate the development of renewable energies. Whether Russia will eventually turn into a perfectly green economy, I cannot say, and maybe this is not necessary. But reducing the dependence by potentially moving into industries which will do well even if the oil price collapses, or even do better, so are negatively related to the oil price when the oil price collapsed, is a smart thing. To give you one example of those, you can think about the Emirates. So the Emirates developed a very successful, flourishing airline. They also have oil. Now, of course, one of the most important ingredients for a functioning airline is oil. So what you have here are two industries which are negatively correlated in terms of their performance. So if the oil price is particularly high, the cost for the airlines is particularly high, meaning that they won't do that well. But if the oil price is low, the oil which is needed to fly a plane is particularly low, such that the cost is low and the profits of the airline are particularly high. These things are not accidental, so those countries strategically thought about the development of industries which could buffer the negative impact of the collapse of the oil price on the economy. Russia could in principle do something similar. As I emphasized several times throughout this talk, the job of the economist, similar to a doctor, is to give advice to the patient. In the end of the day, the leadership of the country, which is the brain of the patient, needs to make a decision whether he or she wants to take this medicine or that medicine. Or all right, so we have 2 minutes left. So we either get one more question or wait for 60 seconds. Okay. Well, if there are no questions, let me wrap this up with re-emphasizing one last time an important thing. I think for historical reasons, what economists do and what economists are is not understood and well known in this country by many people. It's unfortunate because, as I say, I think of the economist as a doctor of the economy. You need a doctor who just takes a look at, makes sure, are you okay or you're not okay. So I love my job. Coming from the Soviet Union, I also wasn't exposed to the concept of being an economist. But when I went to university, I enjoyed this, and since then I'm loving it. Now, if you're interested in what we discussed today, or in any of the other lectures, the joint bachelor program of HSC and NES is one of those places which you can apply to and learn about those things. And I'm sure the organizers can give you, because I don't know which email to give now, but I'm sure the organizers can give you my email. It's also publicly available. You just Google my name. So just Google my name. Alrighty. So thank you very much. I hope that was fun. And have a nice evening. And yeah, I hope you understood that this is a positive message here. So this can be fixed if people would listen to economists and get an education as an economist. I think it's an amazing thing. All right. Have a nice evening.